Welcome to the second season of the Geopolitical Puzzle. For this episode, my guest is Joel Baguandin from Guyana. Joel Baguandin is a financial advisor and political consultant based in Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. In this episode, Joel shared his opinions on the border controversy between Guyana and Venezuela over the Essequibo region and its geopolitical impact on Latin America, the Caribbean, and the world. Hello, Joel. How are you?
I'm doing quite well.
It's a pleasure to have you today as a guest in this second season of the Geopolitical Puzzle. Today, we will discuss a crucial topic that involves geopolitics. It's the tension between Venezuela and Guyana over the Essequibo region. We will also analyze part of your article published in the Guyana Standards titled The Guyana Venezuela Border Controversy, the Geopolitics of Oil and Regional Security. To understand this situation, could you please briefly explain what the Essequibo region is and why it is in dispute?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me on this podcast of yours and reaching out to me. The Essequibo region is it represents two-thirds of Guyana's landmass. That means and it is the size it is larger than the size of England. Larger than England. That's to give a little bit of international perspective. And maybe 90% of it is covered in forest. But not just forest, it is also rich in other natural resources we have, other minerals such as gold, bauxite. We have large deposits of gold, bauxite, diamond, uranium, and then, of course, we have crude oil offshore, which extends into the Atlantic Ocean, which we're currently producing. So, in terms of what it means for Guyana, it's more than half of the country, two-thirds of the country, and the resources are substantial, of the country. So imagine if you to take Guyana physically, if you look at the map, and this is physically displayed, and when we talk about the controversy, the border issue between the two countries, it is depicted in the map, which is can be viewed on the internet. You'd practically see that it's almost like practically wiping Guyana off of the map. So that's what it means in terms of the context, or why there is, well, you said dispute. We To be politically correct, we don't really refer to it as a dispute. The reason for that is because the border was actually settled in more than 100 years ago, about 124 years ago, 18 through the 1899 arbitral award. And up until 1962, Venezuela adhered to, honored, and respected that 1899 agreement. And Guyana was British Guyana then. We were a colony of the British. And in 1962, the news surfaced that Guyana was about to gain independence from Great Britain. And that actually happened in 1966. And so after Venezuela learned that Guyana is about to gain independence, the view now, based on documented evidence that have emerged now since then, in terms of what happened then, it was motivated by imperialism or imperialist motives. So it was never a credible case on the part of Venezuela. And so we in the context of the 1966 Geneva Agreement, which was an agreement that British Guyana, that the Great Britain leaders entered into after Venezuela, you know, stimulated this or raised this issue in terms of the border, whereby they were making a claim over two-thirds of Guyana's border that was already settled vis-a-vis the 1899 award. They went and entered into this 1966 Geneva Agreement, which was an agreement to settle that controversy. So, in the context of the 1966 Geneva Agreement, which we are arguing that Venezuela has misrepresented, that it was a controversy. Now, fast forward to today, in today's context, we are even arguing now that it is not even a controversy; it is a claim, and it has been a baseless claim because from 1962 to now, more than 60 years, Venezuela has failed to produce a single shred of evidence to substantiate its claim. And hence, it's no dispute. The border is settled. So, and this is why we have exhausted all the different mechanisms and channels to resolve the issue from since 1962 through the United Nations, including the United Nations Good Office. And it was the United Nations, and this is what the United Nations was set up for in the post-World War era, fundamentally to settle issues and disputes of this nature following the World War II, One and Two era. And so that is the body that we have engaged, and it is through that body, which Venezuela happens to be, by the way, if an original member or a founding member of the United Nations Charter. So, and so that is why in a subsequent article I said that when Venezuela's president, he made it clear Venezuela's position is that they do not recognize the ICJ, which is the International Court of Justice. That's the ultimate place that the highest court, the highest court in the world to settle these matters. It is an arm of the United Nations, and the fact that they are an original member, it means they have subscribed to that framework. And so for them to say that they don't recognize the ICJ, then it runs counter to the fact that they are a signatory to the United Nations Charter. It's contradictory.
We will discuss in the following questions these particular topics, Joel, and thank you for your explanation. This dispute or this kind of situation between both countries has been ongoing for many years, as you explained, and is related to the following question, Joel. Consistently, Venezuela, as you mentioned, claims over Essequibo region. But recent, we have some kind of aggravation over the last 8 years since 2015, suggesting that it's probably motivated this situation because the discovery of crude oil offshore Guyana. Can you elaborate a little bit more about this situation?
So there are different schools of thought, and of course, oil, we call it, it's the politics of oil or the geopolitics of oil. Certainly, that is a credible and legitimate underpinning or motivation on the part of Venezuela. And to lend credence to that notion, since 1962 up until 2015, when oil was discovered in commercial quantities offshore for the first time, then is when this matter, Venezuela, they issue a decree. And there were several attempts of incursion in the Atlantic. And so it picked up some steam in 2015, immediately following the discovery of crude. And then now, in this recent context, in this recent situation, fast forward from 2015 to now, I think the situation is more than just the politics of oil. There are other factors at play as well, which include largely Venezuela's own political situation. And what is their political situation? So we got to understand it from their political perspective to understand the geopolitical dynamics. And from their political perspective is that Venezuela, and if you listen to the aggression and some of the statements and the exchanges between President Maduro and our president here, President Dr. Mohammed Irfan Ali, of recent, before we had the Argyle Declaration, which is recently brokered in St. Vincent by CELAC and CARICOM. There were several exchanges between the two leaders, and Maduro consistently accused Guyana of being subject to ExxonMobil, and he has asserted that ExxonMobil is controlling Guyana and calling the shots in Guyana, and controlling the government, and all these sort of imperialism sort of
Right. His style.
features.
His style, by the way.
Yeah, and but there is a background to that we have to understand, and the background to that is that Venezuela, they have a particular issue, or as we would say in Guyana, they have a bone to pick with with ExxonMobil, because ExxonMobil was in Venezuela and they had an agreement. They had an agreement when crude was discovered, and this was under Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez. And then Chavez went unilaterally, unilaterally to his parliament, his National Assembly, passed a law, nationalized the oil discovery, nationalized the oil operations, took it away from Exxon, effectively abandoning that agreement, disregarding that agreement. And that is where the problem started for Venezuela in because of that issue, that situation there. It ended up into a major dispute between ExxonMobil, the co-venture, and the Venezuelan government. It went to arbitration, international arbitration. Venezuela became liable to Exxon. Exxon and their co-venture partner at the time were seeking nearly $40 billion US dollars in compensation. They got some of that in settlement. And since then, sanctions came upon Venezuela, sanctions after sanction, and then the turmoil began to unfold rapidly. And so they have a legitimate issue, specific issue with ExxonMobil. That's why they don't like ExxonMobil. Now, and so up to in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, Venezuela GDP was nearly 400 billion. Today, their GDP has shrunk to less than 100 billion. Up in 2022, I looked at their GDP, it's $90 billion. That's a massive, massive shrinkage of their GDP. So they have a humanitarian crisis, they have a political crisis, they
Economic
have a
crisis.
social crisis, they have an economic crisis. And so that is their situation. And so um, Maduro, Maduro's political dilemma is that the US, now you had the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which created again another global turmoil in terms of the oil market,
Exactly.
oil prices
Energy, gas,
creating,
etc.
right. So the US needed another supplier, and so they temporarily eased sanctions on Venezuela, but conditionally, and those conditions include Venezuela must move to an election in 2024 with the aim of restoring democracy. And under Maduro, Venezuela is not a democracy. They're not a market economy. Those are the fundamental values of the US, and what they promote. And so they want to achieve that with Venezuela. That The last election they had, it didn't work out well. They had an election. Maduro, who is a military dictator, did not allow the alternative government to succeed, and so there was a parallel government. You may recall, and that parallel government eventually, they abandoned, because it wasn't working. So now Maduro, now having sanction eased conditionally, he has to do something.
He's using this situation as a pretext to start to distract the opinion, etc. Right?
Correct. Yeah. So on one hand, there is the politics of oil, which is a legitimate factor in these geopolitical maneuverings or developments. And then on the other hand, he has his own political dilemma, which is a huge motivating factor as well. But it's very complicated for him. He's in a serious dilemma.
Your answer is related to this comment. Many media outlets right now mention that this tension in the Essequibo border has raising concerns about possible military conflicts. However, many of them believe that this is unlikely. Why I'm saying this? Because I would like to talk about Guyana's politicians. How have the Guyana government and politicians react to the Venezuelan position? And what do you think about the latest referendum organized by dictator Maduro regime claiming over the Essequibo region? But something that I read, I don't know, was in your article or probably in another source, that is unbelievable. Some Guyanese politicians agree with Maduro, something that is, but I would like to know your thoughts about what is the government position and the politicians in your country about all this situation.
So, thank you for raising that, and let me clarify that immediately. The politicians of the country, both government and opposition, this is one issue that they've, since in the 60s, since it became an issue raised by Venezuela or stirred up by Venezuela, it has always been a national, treated as a national issue in a bipartisan way. So they've always been unified. So there is no division there on the part of the opposition, the political opposition, and the government. Where you may have read that some quarters in Guyana that perhaps agree with Maduro, they are not, that's not from the political spectrum. Those are other, it's a smaller group of people who subscribe to the very narrative of Maduro, similar narrative in terms of Exxon. They've been attacking Exxon, and in fact, the meeting that we had, the meeting that we had brokered by Silak and Kari Cummins in Vincent, Maduro had with him a huge pile of document, and those documents were actually newspaper clippings from Guyana, which are consistent. They are commentaries and critiques from people debating in Guyana, beating up ExxonMobil, attacking ExxonMobil, accusing the government of the same things Maduro accusing the government. And they've been doing that consistently. And so he had that, he walked with that. So, which means he's been monitoring the, but that is not coming from the politicians. That's coming from another group of people, Guyanese, unfortunately, and they have other. The narrative is convenient for them for whatever is their agenda, which may be politically motivated.
Very, very interesting. In your article, which is very interesting, you mentioned something that caught my attention. Venezuela has changed and has become a problematic country from an investment perspective. What is the role of Exxon right now in this particular situation? Because, for example, according to Associate Press, ExxonMobil says it will stay in Guyana long term, regardless of the territorial dispute, with Venezuela. And also, we know that ExxonMobil drilling 63 projects right now, bringing Guyana's production to 600,000 barrels per day. which is very important, you see, for the economy of your country. So, what are your thoughts about that? Why Venezuela become a problematic country?
So they've become a problematic country following the very example that I alluded to earlier with Exxon. In their case, ExxonMobil and the government of Venezuela, then when they moved the National Assembly, changed the law, nationalized the oil operations there. Since then, they became a problematic country. They are not a country that necessarily uphold rule of law, democratic principles, and with all these different crises that they have, all the crises they have, humanitarian, economic. So that is what I meant. In that context, I said they're a problematic. They've become a problematic country. Of course, that which underpin the sanction from the US. One may ask as well, and this is public knowledge, international news, I'm sure, carry this. How is it that Maduro survived with sanctions? Well, the reason he survived is because he has the military, the military's loyalty, he's backed by the military, and he facilitates drug trade. And so that is how he survived, right? So for all these years, because he facilitated um, largely drug trade when during the days of the sanction. The role of Exxon, of course, yes, we are happy that ExxonMobil, and for strategic reasons as well. For strategic reasons, Exxon, when they were granted a 1999 prospecting license to explore offshore, they were a co-venture. They had co-venture with other companies, which eventually left, and then they got other co-venture partners, and they were the operator. Strategically, we are happy that it is Exxon because they're a US company, a US multinational company. Because if, as it did happen, there were exercise, there were flexing of military muscles on the part of Venezuela, there were leading up to the Argyle Declaration, which was recently brokered, there were a lot of military demonstrations and posturing to the extent that Brazil mobilized their military at the border that the three countries shared in the event of any possible incursion or invasion attempts on the part of Venezuela. So those were real, demonstrations and posturings and so forth, which created a lot of tension within the region, and we had to de escalate. Despite all of that, Exxon said that we are here to stay. They are not bothered by the what is taking place between the two countries. Their role, of course, is that they are not involved in the politics. They're here to do what they have to do: explore, drill, extract and produce the oil. They're here to invest and ramp up production and make a profit, a return on their investment. And it's a long term investment, it's a long term commitment here and that is between the agreement of the country that we have as a country with ExxonMobil. We don't have a national oil company as in the case of Venezuela. Our oil operation here is by way of a petroleum agreement, the production sharing agreement model, whereby the oil companies, they are the contractor, contracted by the government of Guyana to explore and develop and produce the oil resources and the natural gas resources. So we want them to stay, and that is very important for us because it has several ramifications and impact. Because it is important in the sense that the fact that Exxon says that we're not going anywhere, it helped the country and the government to, despite the tension, to ensure that the confidence level in the business climate is not affected. And fortunately, the confidence, the investors' confidence, and the business climate, it was not impacted in any material way. That was important. So that is their role. Their role is to honor their agreement and do their part. But they have no role to play in the politics. But of course, by virtue of them being a US company, we as a country leverage that to deepen our relations with the United States government because they are our one of our key partners in this because we don't have the military, or we don't have a military that could stand up to Venezuela's military. We have a very weak military. We don't have the type of hardware and resources and even personnel resources to really match that of Venezuela. So obviously we need backings. We need strong, hardcore military backings, which we have secured with our international partners, namely the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and other countries.
The conflict itself represents, of course, geopolitical dimension. We know that Venezuela is Russia's most important partner in Latin America. Both countries have a strong commercial and military relations and share geopolitical vision of the world. And we know the anti-American rhetoric or narrative that dictator Maduro has. How does this situation affect the geopolitical scenario in South America or in the Caribbean area?
So because this is a very active and very sensitive situation here in Guyana, from Guyana's perspective, and of course for the region at large, Latin America and the Caribbean, I would want to be very conservative. I have my views, I have my scenarios in my head, but I would want to be very careful and conservative into how I approach that because home here in Guyana, I'm an active public commentator, and I think I would have over the years after doing this for maybe 6+ years, I have built up some degree of weight when I speak, or credibility or influence or whatever. Right? So I want to be very circumspect in how I approach that question. I would say this much. Let's look at let's look at the geopolitics of the region from the major powers in the context of the BRICS and in the context of competing with the US. If you go back to the the Cold War era, the United States never wanted, after post-World War, the the British, Great Britain, or Europe as a whole to maintain its dominant influence and control on this part of the world, this side of the world, the Western Hemisphere, especially since South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean on this side of the world is very close in proximity geographically to North America, the United States. And they have managed to achieve that. They have achieved that through different international agreements post World War. For many years, up until now, the US has managed to dominate its influence and control in this region, broadly Latin American Caribbean. Although now, in this era where we have evolved through through that era when the world was dominated and controlled by military power, then political power. Now economic power is the motivating factor, the primary from the three that is ruling the world, economic power. So China, Russia, India, particularly China and India, are competing for influence in this part of the world, Latin America and the Caribbean, with the US. And so one has to look at their foreign policy and their strategy. China is very very close. And so and then you had the emergence and the formation and emergence of the BRICS arrangement, which is growing. Now, with that framework, I don't want to elaborate too much on the foreign policy in the context of our foreign policy and the current situation at hand. But let's analyze now in terms of assessing the risk. And this is the important aspect of your question. What is the risk in the context of the broader geopolitics that is playing out? The way I approach analyzing the risk for Latin America and the region is the first important point is that everybody agrees, everyone agrees within the BRICS, the US, that Latin America and the Caribbean is a zone of peace, and everybody wants to maintain this region as a zone of peace and maintain stability. Because we know if anything were to erupt militarily, the impact it would have for the entire region, it would destabilize the entire region. Case in point, as an example, because of the military demonstrations and what is happening now, Lloyd's, the British financial services group, recently upped their risk rating for insurance in this region. That would impact insurance premiums for shipping, which would impact commerce, which would impact goods and supplies coming to this region. And nothing has manifested. There is no war that has manifested. So imagine if we move to a situation where the region is destabilized, what would be the impact on the entire region? So everybody, that's just to give an example of what the impact could be. Now, so everyone has agreed that we want to maintain, and this is why CELAC and CARICOM brokered this meeting between the two leaders with the objective to de-escalate tensions and de-escalate the situation and to maintain the region as a zone of peace. Now, we did a lot of work. Our government did a lot of work on the diplomatic front and through the United Nations. There were a lot of strong statements coming out of Commonwealth, OAS, all these countries, the United Nations, CARICOM, and so on. Now, I am looking at the statements that the superpower countries have made. So we know what is the position of the US. We don't need to analyze the US, but we need to analyze Russia's statement, we need to analyze China's statement, and we need to analyze Brazil's position and what Brazil has done. The first was Brazil. And of course, we expect Brazil because Brazil share a contiguous border with us, landlocked border with us, and they have a vested interest to develop the road connecting Brazil and Guyana, for example. They have an interest in that and to build out a deepwater port because that will open up a whole new wave of benefits for a whole new market for northern Brazil. So they have vested economic interest here, and they took a position that we were happy with. They mobilized military, and their position they took the lead. Brazil took the lead at the regional level, and we're very grateful for that. And so their position was stability. We're going to respect the ICJ ruling, and the two leaders must talk. India put out a statement that was very similar to China. Now we know what is the relationship with India, China, and Russia. And so these statements, these two countries, were their statements that came after everybody else. Those are the most important statements. And their statements were very similar but different from everybody else. Now, from Guyana's perspective, the position that we would like the entire world to take on this matter is that Venezuela must respect the rule of law, they must respect the ICJ process and maintain peace. So, if we have managed to get every country in the world except China, India, Brazil, and Russia to say explicitly that respect the ICJ process, right? And they did that. US did that, UK did, everybody did it. China said that they want a peaceful settlement. They made no reference to the ICJ. And why did they make no reference to the ICJ? Because of Venezuela's position. So they don't want to upset Venezuela. So they're saying, listen, we want peace. So we want a peaceful settlement. And their statement also implies that they want the two leaders to talk. India also made a very similar statement. They made no reference to the ICJ, but they said that they're interested, they're monitoring the situation, and that they're interested in a peaceful settlement, and that the two leaders should talk. Same statement from China. We did not get that statement from US and UK and everybody else. Russia. Now, Russia at the United Nations, they had a very different statement. Russia said that they want a peaceful settlement. They would like to see a peaceful settlement. Interestingly, they said that they support the ICJ process. Interestingly, they support the ICJ process, which Venezuela does not recognize. So we were happy about that. But more interestingly, they said in their statement that they oppose foreign interference in Guyana. Now, obviously, they're referring to the US. Now, the US is not interfering in anything in Guyana. We have engaged the US. We're deepening our relations with the US, right? But I am making references to these statements because from these statements, one who understands the geopolitics of the region and the foreign policy and foreign policy strategies of these countries for this region, you'd be able to assess the risk. And coming out of that, coming out of those statements, shortly after those statements were made, CELAC and CARICOM brokered for the two leaders to meet, Maduro and President Ali. And there was, coming out of that meeting, we had what is called the Argyle Declaration. And within the spirit of that declaration, the tensions, which was the objective, was de-escalated almost instantly. Both countries agreed um, not to engage in any aggressive activities or behavior, and that's where we are today. So the geopolitical risk, in the context, having said all of that, I think the geopolitical risk has been mitigated at this point and kept. I would say it is being kept at a moderate level.
Well, I have a question before wrapping up. Eh, when I saw the map of South America, we have Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana. What is the reaction of Suriname and French Guyana in this conflict? Because you guys share a lot of similarities, in terms of territory, maybe I don't know, culture. What are the reactions of these countries?
Well, for French Guyana, I think we have the support and backing of French Guyana. Suriname, I did not see them make any particular. Well, Suriname is part of CARICOM. They are a member of CARICOM. And so their statement would have been the CARICOM statement by virtue of being a member. Although it should be noted that despite CARICOM's statement as a body that represents CARICOM region, there are a few countries, member countries, that came out and made individual statements, which we were grateful for. For example, Jamaica. Jamaica, which is a country that is a member of CARICOM, they made a separate individual statement in addition to the CARICOM statement. Several other countries stay away from making individual statements, and they have, of course, the CARICOM statement is their position.
Joel, before wrapping up, is there anything that you would like to add? And also, where people can contact with you.
I don't think that I want to add anything. Maybe if we had this podcast a month ago, I may have. But the fact that, from the time you have reached out to me and engaged me to do this podcast, in between we have had that Argyle Declaration. And out of that Argyle Declaration, the two countries have committed to continue engaging on a bilateral level, and that is good. They're scheduled to meet again 3 months from now in Brazil. So those are good. Those are good developments for us. So I wouldn't want to add anything in the context of the fact that we have an Argyle Declaration, which is a commitment to maintain the peace and stability in the region.
It's an ongoing situation.
It is an ongoing situation. The threat is essentially still there because the matter is, from our perspective, from Guyana's perspective, the matter is before the International Court of Justice. And what is before the Court of Justice? Maybe I should state this expressly. Is is the validity, because this is what Venezuela is alleging. Venezuela is alleging that the 1899 arbitral award is null and void. So, what is simply before the International Court of Justice is to rule on whether the 1899 arbitral award in relation to the border between Guyana and Venezuela is valid or null and void. Venezuela would have to substantiate that by way of evidence, which they have not been able to do for the past 6 decades. So that is what is before the court. So I don't want to say anything other than that. The threat is still there. We are very confident of a favorable outcome in the court matter, which is that the 1899 arbitral award is valid, that there is nothing to invalidate it, no evidence to invalidate it. And how to contact me? LinkedIn. I have an active profile on LinkedIn. I post contents there regularly, frequently. I write frequently on these matters, political matters, finance issues, economic issues, geopolitics. Yeah, I have a very rich profile, a very rich body of work there, and you have all my contact information there.
Joel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
I'm Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. Thank you so much, everyone. The views, information, or opinions expressed in this episode are my own and do not represent my employer's views.